She didn't scream when he handed her the divorce papers. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't even flinch. She looked at him, this man who had built an empire, who made governments nervous and rivals disappear, and she smiled, quiet, knowing, the kind of smile that didn't comfort, the kind that warned. He thought that smile meant she was broken. He had no idea it meant she had already won. The moment he signed his name on that paper, the most powerful man in the continent made the most catastrophic mistake of his life, because the woman he just discarded, she was carrying his heir, and she was far from finished. Before this story goes any further, and trust me, it goes places you are not ready for. If you have ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person and pay for it in full, subscribe to this channel right now. Because what is about to unfold is not just a story. It is a reckoning. And it starts here. The city of Marveth did not sleep. It pulsed. It breathed through glass towers and underground corridors, through whispered deals and unmarked vehicles, through a network so vast and so invisible that most people who lived inside it didn't even know it existed. But everyone who mattered knew one name, Raziel Voss. At 36, Raziel Voss was not merely wealthy. Wealth was for men who needed to be counted. Raziel was beyond counting. He controlled the northern shipping lanes, 3 private intelligence firms, and a legitimate real estate portfolio that served as the clean face of something far darker underneath. Governments didn't audit him. Rivals didn't challenge him twice. The few journalists who had attempted to investigate him had found, swiftly, efficiently, that their careers, their sources, and occasionally their courage had simply ceased to exist. He was not cruel for the pleasure of it. That was what made him dangerous. He was precise, calculated. He made decisions the way a surgeon makes incisions. Clean, deliberate, without hesitation and without sentiment. Sentiment, in his world, was the first sign of a weakness someone else would eventually exploit. He had built everything on that principle. His empire, his alliances, his reputation, and his marriage. Those who sat closest to him, his inner circle, his lieutenants, the men who had watched him operate for years, would later say that the moment Raziel Voss decided to divorce his wife was the moment everything began to unravel. Not because he loved her, but because he had never once stopped to ask himself whether he should be afraid of her. He was not afraid of anything. That was his second mistake. His first was marrying her for the wrong reasons. His second was leaving her for even worse ones. And his third, the one that would cost him everything, was doing it with a calm face, as if it were simple, as if she were simple. In the war room that night, surrounded by men who had never once questioned his judgment, Raziel Voss slid a document across the table, lifted his glass of aged scotch, and said 4 words that would echo through the rest of his life. It's already been decided. Nobody in that room dared to ask what it had cost him. Nobody imagined it would cost him everything. Her name was Sorvain Dael. The night her husband handed her the divorce papers, she was sitting alone in the east wing of the Voss estate, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold an hour ago, reading a letter she had already read 11 times. It was from her doctor. She had found out 4 days ago. She hadn't told anyone, not her sister. Not the single friend she still had left after 3 years of slowly disappearing inside Raziel's world. And certainly not him. She was 10 weeks pregnant. She had been trying to find the right moment, the right words. Whether there even was a right moment inside a marriage that had felt, for the past year, less like a partnership and more like a performance. 2 people occupying the same space, playing roles they had both agreed to stop believing in. She had promised herself she would tell him this week. And then he walked in with the papers. Sorvain was 29 years old, and she had spent 3 years learning how to be invisible inside a life that was too large and too loud for someone like her. She had grown up in the coastal town of Dravain, far from cities like Marveth, far from men like Raziel. Her father had been a maritime surveyor, methodical, principled, and brilliant in the way that left no room for performance. Her mother had been the kind of woman who spoke 4 languages and raised her voice once in her life, and it had been enough. They had raised Sorvain to be composed, to read a room before she walked into it, to understand what was beneath the surface of things, because that was always where the truth lived. Those instincts had kept her safe in Raziel's world. They had also made her invisible within it. She was not the woman his associates expected on his arm, not cold enough, not polished enough, not ruthless enough. She wore simple clothes in rooms full of diamonds. She remembered the names of staff members that everyone else looked through. She asked questions in spaces where women were expected to sit beautifully and say nothing complicated. Raziel had found that quality intriguing once, early on, when everything was still new and he was still capable of finding things intriguing. Then the Empire demanded more of him. The stillness he had once found interesting became, in his mind, a liability. A reminder that she belonged nowhere near his world. That he had perhaps made a sentimental decision. And sentiment was weakness, and weakness had no place beside him. He had stopped seeing her, not physically. They still occupied the same estate, attended the same functions, sat at the same table. But he had stopped registering her presence as anything beyond furniture in a room he passed through. Sorvain had noticed the exact week it changed. She had said nothing. Because what Raziel Voss had failed to understand, what no one in his world had invested a moment in discovering, was that Sorvain Dale's stillness was not passivity. It was patience. And patience in the right hands is the most powerful force in existence. She set the doctor's letter beside her cold tea. She looked at the divorce papers in her other hand. She looked at his signature. Sharp, aggressive, not a moment's hesitation. And then she did something that would later stop him cold when he found out. She smiled. He expected tears by morning. That was the thing about Raziel Voss. He had studied people his entire life. He knew how they broke. He understood the exact shape grief took when it arrived, the way it collapsed posture and reddened eyes and made voices unreliable. He had seen powerful men dissolve in the chair across from his desk. He had watched rivals, negotiators, even allies come apart under the right kind of pressure. He knew what breaking looked like. So when he walked into the main dining room the following morning, earlier than usual, for reasons he chose not to examine, and found Sorvain already seated at the far end of the table, composed, dressed, a pen moving steadily across a leather notebook, he stopped. Just for a second. Just long enough for something unreadable to cross his face. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing, set the pen down. Then she raised her eyes to his, and what he found there was not what he had steeled himself for. No redness, no swelling, no evidence of a sleepless night. She looked, if anything, clearer than he had seen her in months. Good morning. Her voice was even, unhurried, as if yesterday had been an ordinary Thursday and not the day he had ended their marriage with 4 words and a signature. Raziel said nothing. He moved to his end of the table, sat, reached for the coffee that had already been poured. She had arranged that, he realized distantly, every morning for 3 years. Arranged as it had always been in silence, and looked at her over the rim of the cup. You're not going to say anything. It came out almost involuntarily, which irritated him. Sorvain looked at him with an expression that bordered on serene. About what? The room felt different, smaller. He set the cup down. About the papers. She tilted her head, a fractional, deliberate tilt, as though the question had arrived from a considerable distance, and was not especially interesting. I read them. Your legal team is thorough. She returned to her notebook. I'll have my response ready by Friday. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Response. She didn't look up. I have questions about the asset valuation, specifically the Drevane coastal properties. She turned a page. I think the numbers are off. The Drevane properties. He had acquired those 18 months ago through a subsidiary holding company running through 4 different jurisdictions. The paperwork alone had consumed the better part of 3 months across his legal team. The notion that she had any awareness of their existence, let alone their valuation, was not possible. He had been meticulous. How do you know about those properties? She looked up. In that moment, he saw something in her expression he could not place and could not name, and the not naming of it bothered him in a way he had no ready framework for. Because I pay attention, Raziel. She said it gently, patiently, the tone of someone explaining something that should have been understood long ago to someone they bear no ill will toward. She gathered her notebook, capped her pen, and rose. Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. I've asked Dovin to set the table for one since I'll be taking mine in the study. She walked out. He sat there. The coffee cooled in front of him, untouched, and for the first time in longer than he could recall, Raziel Voss sat alone in a room and felt something that had no immediate name. The sensation that he had missed something significant. Something that had been directly in front of him the entire time. He had just never turned. He thought he was in control of this situation. That thought lasted precisely as long as it took him to remember the look in her eyes. Then it dissolved entirely. Not everyone in the Voss estate was surprised by the divorce. One person had been waiting for it. Her name was Sinara Vielle, 32 years old. The daughter of Raziel's longest-standing business partner. She had existed in the orbit of his world long enough that she had begun, with great deliberateness, to think of it as hers. She was striking with the intentionality of expensive things, constructed, deliberate, with the clear understanding that the effort should never show. She moved through rooms as though she owned the floor beneath her. She smiled at the right people and looked past the rest. Over the past year, she had cultivated a closeness with Raziel's inner circle that had gone largely unremarked by everyone except Sorvain, who had clocked it within a fortnight and chosen not to react. Because Sorvain had learned long ago that what you refuse to respond to is often more powerful than what you do. But Sinara had read that silence as obliviousness. That was her first miscalculation. The morning after the divorce papers were served, Sinara arrived at the estate under the pretense of a meeting with Raziel's second lieutenant, Draven Mao. She was 20 minutes early. Intentional. She moved through the east corridor with the ease of someone who had already mentally redecorated the space, and she nearly walked past the open doorway to the morning sitting room before she registered it was occupied. Sorvain stood at the window, looking out at the grounds with that particular stillness of hers, the kind that Sinara had always found maddening. The stillness of someone who was either thinking nothing at all or thinking something so vast it required complete silence to contain it. Sinara arranged her expression in the doorway. "I heard," she said. Her voice carried the precise texture of sympathy she had practiced. "I'm so sorry, Sorvain." Sorvain turned from the window. She studied Sinara in silence, and in that pause Sinara felt, briefly, inexplicably, the discomfort of being read. "Are you?" Sorvain's voice held no edge, not hostile, honest in a manner that cut cleanly and left no room for misinterpretation. Sinara held her smile in place. "Of course. This must be devastating." Sorvain considered her. Her gaze moved across Sinara's face with a calm that had no performance in it. Then she said something so plain and so exact that Sonara would find herself returning to it for weeks. "You've been in love with him for 18 months. She delivered it the way a doctor states a diagnosis. No drama, no accusation. Just the fact, set between them on the table. I noticed. I chose not to address it because it wasn't relevant at the time. The air in the room shifted. Sonara held her composure through sheer accumulated practice. That's not. Sorvain had already turned back to the window. "You should be careful," she said, her voice unchanged in tone or temperature. "Men like Raziel don't fall in love with women who want them. They align with them for a while, and then they make decisions. A pause, brief, the kind that lands cleanly, and the women who wanted them discover too late what kind of decisions those are. Nothing more." The conversation was over. Sonara left the doorway with her expression assembled and her thoughts in disorder. Because Sorvain had not threatened her, had not wept or confronted or made anything of a scene. She had told the truth, her voice flat and even, and returned to the window. And that, somehow, was far worse than anything else she could have done. Sonara had arrived expecting a woman coming undone. What she encountered was something else entirely. She didn't yet know what to call it, but she had already begun to be afraid of it. 3 days after the divorce papers were served, Raziel Voss hosted a gathering at the estate. He called it a business dinner. His inner circle understood it as something else. A signal, a demonstration, a carefully orchestrated evening designed to communicate that nothing in the architecture of his life had shifted. That things were ordered, that they were always ordered. 41 people filled the main hall. Finance, logistics, security, the quiet representatives of interests that printed their names nowhere. The hall had been arranged to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The long obsidian table, the low amber lighting, the kind of silence between courses that reminded everyone present of exactly where they were and who sat at the head of it. Sonara Vial was there, positioned 3 chairs from Raziel's right. Not by accident. What no one had anticipated was Sorvain. She appeared at the entrance to the hall at precisely 8:47, in a dress the color of deep water, her dark hair pulled back simply, her posture so composed it looked almost architectural. She had not been invited. She had not been uninvited either, because Raziel had not imagined she would come, had assumed she would retreat, as she always had, to the quieter edges of his world. Instead, she walked in. And the room, this room full of people who had spent careers learning to show nothing, shifted visibly. Eyes moved. Conversations fractured mid-sentence. A glass paused on the way to someone's mouth and stayed there. Raziel saw her the moment she entered. His expression did not change, but his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, closed into a loose fist and then released. She found a seat at the far end of the table, claimed it, and asked no one's permission. She sat, accepted the menu handed to her by a staff member who clearly hadn't received updated instructions, and began reading it with the focused attention of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. The dinner proceeded. What happened an hour into it was not something Raziel had planned. One of the guests, Therrell Can, a freight broker from the northern ports with a considerable reputation for saying whatever crossed his mind regardless of consequence, leaned toward Sorvain during the 3rd course and said, audible to the 6 people nearest him, that he had heard about the change in circumstances and wished to offer his sympathies and, also, while he was at it, his card. He placed it on the table in front of her. He produced the smile of a man who considered himself charming. The nearby table went very still. Sorvain looked at the card. She looked at Therrell Can, with an expression of such complete and unhurried neutrality that he blinked. Then she said, level, perfectly composed. I appreciate the thought. But I'm still a Voss. 4 words. delivered the way someone states a compass heading. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. And then, from the head of the table, a voice. Low, deliberate. The kind that fills a room by weight alone. She's right. Every head turned. Raziel had not stood. He hadn't needed to. He was looking at Theral Khan with the flat, settled attention of someone who has already determined the outcome of a situation and is waiting for the other party to catch up. While she remains in this house, Raziel said, each word placed with the calm of someone who has never needed to raise his voice. She is afforded every courtesy due to my wife. He let that land. His gaze never left Khan's face. Any confusion about that should be resolved immediately. Theral Khan retrieved his card from the table. He nodded once. He said nothing further for the remainder of the evening. The dinner continued. But something had fractured in the room's understanding of what was happening. Because Raziel Voss had just publicly placed his name around a woman he had served divorce papers to 72 hours earlier. No explanation offered, no contradiction acknowledged, as though both things could coexist. His inner circle exchanged glances they were careful to keep brief. Sonara Vale, 3 seats to his right, sat in perfect stillness. She set her fork down, with great precision. She did not pick it up again. She had spent 18 months building something in this room, in these halls, in the careful architecture of her presence beside him. She had measured the distance between where she stood and where she wanted to be, and she had closed it, inch by inch, with the patience of someone who understood that the most coveted things in the world are never simply taken, they are waited for. And then she had waited, and the gap had closed, and then this woman, this quiet, unremarkable woman from a coastal town, had walked through the door and sat down, and Raziel Voss had put his name around her in front of 41 witnesses. Sonara reached for her wineglass instead. Her hand was perfectly steady. And at the far end of the table, Sorvain sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face still, her eyes straight ahead. But beneath the table, where no one could see, her hand rested flat against her abdomen. Just for a moment. Just long enough. The order came 4 days after the dinner. It didn't come from Raziel directly. That was how she knew it came from him. Raziel Voss never delivered uncomfortable things in person. He had people for that. Always had. Men and women whose entire function was to stand between his decisions and their consequences so that his hands remained clean and his expression remained unreadable. It was one of the first things Sorvain had understood about him. He was not a man who avoided hard conversations out of timidity. He avoided them because he had decided, long ago, that distance was its own form of authority. So when Maret, the estate's head of household, a woman of 50 with the bearing of someone who had weathered 3 different regimes in this house and intended to survive several more, appeared at the door of Sorvain's study with an envelope and an expression of profound neutrality, Sorvain already knew what it contained before she opened it. A residence had been arranged, furnished, staffed, in the Varan district, 40 minutes from the estate. She was expected to vacate by end of the week. The letter was signed by Raziel's solicitor, not by Raziel. Sorvain read it twice, folded it along its original crease, set it on the desk. "Thank you, Maret," she said. That was all. Maret lingered in the doorway 2 seconds longer than her role required. A shift crossed her face, barely perceptible, but Sorvain caught it, because Sorvain always caught those things. Then she nodded once and withdrew. Alone in the study, Sorvain sat with the afternoon light coming through the high windows at an angle that made the dust in the air visible. Small, suspended particles drifting through the silence. She looked at the letter. She looked at the window. She looked at the small framed photograph on the corner of the desk. Her parents on the Dravain coast, her mother laughing at something out of frame. Her father watching her the way men in her family had always looked at the women they loved, like they were worth every ounce of attention. She opened the desk drawer. Inside, beneath a leather folder, was the doctor's letter. Still folded. Still unread by anyone but her. She was 11 weeks now. She picked up her phone. She made 2 calls. The first was 3 sentences. A name, a question, an answer. The second was longer, and by the end of it her expression had settled into something that was not quite a smile, but sat close enough to one to be, if you knew what it meant, alarming. She was packed and gone by Thursday morning, earlier than requested, on her own terms. What she left on the desk in the study, visible, deliberate, impossible to overlook, was a single sheet of paper, a printed financial summary, 14 pages reduced to 1, annotated in her handwriting across the margins. It detailed, with documented precision, every discrepancy in the Drevane coastal property valuations, every shell account, every jurisdiction, every figure that didn't reconcile, not a threat, not a demand. Information. Laid on a desk in a room she was no longer in. Draven Mao found it first. Draven was Raziel's most trusted lieutenant. Careful, loyal, possessed of the particular intelligence that distinguishes between what to bring immediately and what to hold. He brought this immediately. He brought it to Raziel within the hour. Raziel read it standing up. He read it again. He set it down, picked it up, set it down. His expression did not change, not visibly. But something behind his eyes shifted. A recalibration, slow and fundamental, the kind that occurs when a person realizes that the map they have been using does not match the terrain beneath their feet. Where is she? Flat. Controlled. Draven told him. The Vorin residence. As arranged. Raziel stood in silence. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number that belonged to a different category of situation entirely. A man named Farron Solt, who dealt exclusively in information, in finding things deliberately hidden, in knowing things that were not supposed to be known. Find out who she is, Raziel said. Not who I think she is. A beat. Who she actually is. A pause on the line. Everything? Farron asked. Everything. His voice dropped. And Farron. Don't bring me a surface reading. Bring me whatever is underneath it. He ended the call. He stood alone in the study that still held, faintly, the scent of her. Something understated, unassuming, the kind that announces nothing and lingers anyway. Something he realized with a slow and uncomfortable clarity he had stopped noticing years ago without ever registering the loss. He believed removing her from the house would uncomplicate things. He was wrong. It had made everything immeasurably more complicated, because the document she had left on the desk was not the act of a woman retreating. It was the act of a woman who knew exactly how much ground she occupied and had chosen, for reasons he could not yet fully understand, to show him a fraction of it. She had not left in defeat. She had departed on a schedule of her own construction, earlier than asked, and left behind a single page that functioned less like a goodbye and more like an opening move. He had served her divorce papers and she had responded with a financial audit. He sat with that for a moment. And somewhere behind the strategy and the calculation and the careful architecture of his detachment, something quiet had begun asking a question he had no answer for yet. What had he missed? Farron Solt came back in 6 days. That was fast. Faster than Raziel had expected, which meant either the information was shallow, easily surfaced, or it was significant enough that even Farron had felt the weight of it and moved accordingly. It was not shallow. Even Farron, a man who had made a career of being unsurprised, had moved faster than usual. Raziel was alone in the war room when Farron arrived. No staff, no lieutenants. He had cleared the room. No reason given, which was unusual enough that Draven Mao had filed it in the careful internal ledger he kept of things worth watching. Farron set a folder on the table. Thick. Physical. In a world where everything was encrypted and distributed across servers, Farron still used paper for what mattered most. Paper left no trail. Paper you could burn. He remained standing. He watched Raziel open the folder, and something in Farron's face. This man who had personally uncovered the concealed assets of 3 government ministers and the double identity of a regional organization head was guarded in a way that suggested he was genuinely uncertain how the next few minutes would unfold. Raziel read the first page. He turned to the second, then the third. His hand, flat on the table, pressed down slightly, the only visible register that anything was landing. He read for 9 minutes without speaking, without looking up, turning each page with the deliberate stillness of a man forcing himself to stay level when everything beneath the surface was doing the opposite. Then he closed the folder. He was very still. Sorvain Dale. He said it almost to himself. Farron gave a single nod. Her father. Aldrich Dale. Another nod. Outside, the city moved. Traffic, wind, the indifferent percussion of a world that had no idea what was being understood in this room. Aldrich Dale had been dead 11 years. Officially, he had died in a maritime accident off the Dravain coast. A small vessel. A storm. No survivors. Noted by the regional press. Recorded by the relevant authorities, and absorbed into the archive of ordinary tragedies that nobody examines twice. Except that it had not been an accident, and Aldrich Dale had been anything but ordinary. He had been the founder and silent architect of the Dale Consortium, a network constructed over 4 decades with such care that even the people operating within its outer layers had never understood what they were part of. It controlled, through 18 separate legitimate entities, the primary trade infrastructure of the entire southern maritime corridor. Shipping rights, port access, customs channels, the arterial routes through which half of everything that moved in this part of the world actually moved. The consortium had not dissolved when Aldrich died. It had gone dormant. It had gone dormant because the only person Aldrich had trusted with its complete architecture, every name, every agreement, every coded access point, was not a business partner or a lawyer or a seasoned lieutenant. It was his daughter, Sorvain, who had been 19 years old when her father died, who had taken the knowledge he had spent years transferring to her, teaching her to observe, to understand structure, to read numbers the way others read language, and had carried it in silence. Through grief that had no public shape, through years of deliberate invisibility, through a marriage to a man who ran his own empire and had never once considered what was standing beside him. Because the Dale Consortium, dormant for 11 years, still existed. Every account, every agreement, every right and access point, held in trust, held in her name, held in the name of Sorvain Dale, who had arrived in Raziel's world 3 years ago as a woman from a coastal town, who had said nothing, and who had waited. The combined value of the consortium's holdings was 4 times the size of Raziel's entire empire. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about the morning after the divorce papers, her composure, the coffee already poured, the notebook, the pen moving in steady, unbroken lines across the page. He thought about the Dravain property document she had left on his desk. 14 pages reduced to 1. Annotated. Exact. Not a threat. An introduction. She had introduced herself, after 3 years inside his house, by setting a single sheet of paper on his desk and walking out. And it had said, in no words directed at him personally, "This is who I am. This is what I know. This is what you never thought to find out." Everything in him went still. "What else?" he said to Farron. His voice was nearly inaudible. Farron held for only a moment. Then he reached into the folder and placed one more document on the table. A medical record. Recent. 11 weeks. The room tilted. Raziel looked at it without moving. The words were clinical. unambiguous. He read them 3 times because the first 2 his mind refused to fully accept what was in front of him. She was pregnant, 11 weeks pregnant, and she had not said a word. Through the papers, through the dinner, through the transfer to the Voren residence, through all of it, she had carried this alone. And he understood now, with a sudden and devastating clarity, exactly why. Because she had seen, with the same precise and patient intelligence she applied to everything, that he had already made his decision, that telling him would have appeared as leverage, as desperation, as the move of a woman who had run out of options. And Sorvain Dale had not run out of options. She had always had more than he could have imagined. He was only now beginning to understand the scale of that. He just hadn't known. He stood, his chair pushed back against the floor with a sound that felt very loud in the silence of the room. "Get out," he said to Farron. No anger in it, just finality. Farron left without a word. Raziel stood alone in the war room, the medical record on the table before him, the folder beside it. 3 years of a marriage he had dismantled without once asking himself whether he understood what he was dismantling. He pressed both hands flat on the table. He had been wrong. Not in strategy, not in tactics. Those were correctable things. He had been wrong about something that could not be recalculated and adjusted and approached from a different angle. He had looked at Sorvain Dale for 3 years and seen what he had expected to see. A woman from a quiet background. An uncomplicated presence in a complicated life. He had looked at the surface and called it the whole. And now the whole was standing 40 minutes away in a furnished residence in the Voren district, 11 weeks along, in possession of an empire that dwarfed his own. And she had not said a single word. The question was no longer who she was. The question that was going to cost him sleep tonight and every night after was what she was going to do next, and whether it was already too late for it to matter. He went to the Voren residence that same night. He didn't send Draven. He didn't call ahead. He drove himself, something he had not done in 4 years, and he sat in the car outside the building for 6 full minutes, running through nothing useful before he got out. A man who prided himself on decisive movement, motionless in a parked car. The residence was well lit and impersonal. She had been there 4 days, and it still looked like a hotel. Clean, appointed, not yet inhabited. She was in the process of existing inside it rather than belonging to it. She answered the door herself. She was in a gray pullover, her hair loose, and she had clearly been reading. She still held the book, a finger keeping her page. She looked at him with an expression that was the most unguarded he had ever seen on her face. Not frightened, not relieved, not angry, just tired. And something about that tiredness, real, unperformed, nothing held back, reached him beneath the armor he had spent 20 years constructing. The impact was considerable, and he had no defense prepared for it. He said her name. Just that. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. He followed her into the sitting room. She sat. She made no offer of anything. She waited. The book closed in her lap, and the silence between them had texture. Not hostile, not comfortable, but honest. The silence of 2 people who have stopped performing entirely. "I know," he said. He met her gaze, all of it. "Your father, the consortium." He paused. The pregnancy. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, not relief. Something more complicated. The expression of a person who has been carrying something enormous and alone and has just been told the secret is out, though the weight of it remains unchanged. She held his gaze and waited. He sat across from her. Not beside her. He hadn't earned beside her yet, and some quiet part of him already knew it. "Why didn't you tell me?" He asked it without accusation. He needed to understand. Sorvain looked at him for a measured moment. When she spoke, her voice carried no bitterness, no performance of suffering, honest in the manner she had always been, a quality he had spent 3 years mistaking for simplicity. "Because you had already decided," she said, "and I was not going to become a woman who used a child to change a man's mind." She held his gaze. "If you needed me to be carrying your heir to reconsider, then you didn't want me. You wanted what I represented. A beat. I've spent enough of my life being what I represent, Raziel." Her voice steadied. "I was not going to do it inside my own marriage." The room held that. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing adequate to say, not honestly. And he had been dishonest enough with this woman already, and a hollow reply would only lengthen the debt. It was in that silence that his phone pulsed. Not a call. The specific alert, triple pulsed, no sound, that he had programmed years ago for one category of situation only. Perimeter compromised. Situation critical. He was on his feet before it finished. His hand went to her arm. Not to control, just the reflex of a man whose instinct was to place himself between danger and whoever was near him. Old instinct, apparently ineradicable. Stay here. The quiet of the conversation was gone. Operational now. Fast and exact. Sorvain stood up. She did not sit back down. She looked at him with eyes he was only now beginning to understand, and she said, with absolute clarity, "No." He stared at her. "I know what that alert means." Her voice was level. "And I know who triggered it." He went very still. "How?" "Because," she said, moving to the window and looking down at the street below with the focused attention of someone assessing rather than reacting. "Farron Solt is not the only person who finds things out." Below, 3 dark vehicles had positioned themselves across the building's entrance, men moving with the coordinated quiet of professionals, and leaning against the lead vehicle, arms crossed, looking up with an expression of unhurried satisfaction, was a man Raziel recognized immediately. Corvus Lane. The name alone was a category of problem. Corvus Lane ran the Eastern Distribution Network, or had until 18 months ago, when his attempt to absorb 2 of Raziel's southern operations had been taken apart piece by piece. He had withdrawn. In the way men with long memories withdraw, not in defeat, but in postponement. The postponement, it appeared, was over. Raziel was already on the phone to Draven, his other hand, and he noted this, distantly, with the fragment of attention not consumed by the situation below, remained on Sorvain's arm. He became aware of her looking at him. "They're not here for you," she said. He turned to face her fully. "What?" Her expression was settled. Her eyes were clear. "Corvus Lane has been attempting to access the Dale Consortium's southern port agreements for 2 years. She spoke with the directness of someone delivering a briefing. He cannot. The access is biometric and legally entailed to me alone." She paused. "He's not here for you, Raziel. He's here to use me as leverage." The information rearranged everything in approximately 4 seconds. He looked at the woman beside him. This woman he had spent 3 years looking past, whom he had handed divorce papers to, whom he had transferred to a furnished apartment like something to be stored out of sight. And he understood, with a completeness that was almost physically disorienting, the full extent of what he had done. He had not merely underestimated her, he had left her exposed. On purpose, and the people who wanted what she carried, what she had always carried, had noticed. Below, Corvus Lane looked up at the window and raised one hand. A slow, deliberate gesture, patient, certain of itself. Raziel looked at Sorvain. She looked back at him. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not resolution, but recognition. Real recognition. The first they had perhaps ever exchanged, free of assumption, free of pride. The distance between them at last collapsed. Then Sorvain looked back to the street. She drew her phone from the pocket of her gray pullover and dialed a number. She spoke for 40 seconds. Names, coordinates. One sequence of numbers Raziel didn't recognize. 2 words in a language he did not speak. Then she ended the call and pocketed the phone. The same economy of movement she brought to everything. Nothing wasted and nothing performed. Below, something reached Corvus Lane. A call. A message through channels Raziel could not see. The certainty in his posture dissolved. He straightened. He checked his phone. He looked up at the window again, and this time his expression was entirely different. It was recalculation. Within 4 minutes, all 3 vehicles were gone. The street was empty. Raziel stood without moving. He looked at Sorvain. She stood at the window, her phone back in her pocket, her pullover ordinary, her face completely composed, as though she had simply answered a call about a grocery order. "What did you do?" Not alarmed. Something nearer to awe. She turned to him. The tiredness from earlier was still present, but something beneath it had surfaced. Something that had been buried a very long time and had, tonight, stopped waiting. "I called the consortium's legal chair," she said. "Corvus Lane has 3 outstanding maritime liens that the Dale Consortium holds against his Eastern network." She met his gaze. "I authorized them to call all 3 in, simultaneously. By morning, he won't have the liquidity to operate a fishing boat." She had resolved a situation that would have taken Raziel's organization weeks of coordinated effort. Dismantled it in a single phone call, standing in a residence she hadn't even made her own yet, carrying his child and an empire he hadn't known existed. He sat down. Not because he was unsteady, because there are moments when sitting is the only honest response left. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Steady, unhurried, still. "I have spent 3 years," he said, "living in the same house as you." She waited, and I understood nothing. His voice was low, accurate, delivered with the flat precision he reserved for facts he had no defense against. Sorvain was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street had returned to its ordinary midnight silence. No vehicles, no threat, just the city moving through itself as cities do. Indifferent, continuous, unaware. Then, and her voice was gentler than he deserved, "You weren't looking, Raziel." She said it without cruelty. "There's a difference." He sat with that. It was not a complicated sentence. It was, in fact, the simplest thing anyone had said to him in years. And it landed with the weight of something that had been true for a very long time and was only now being said aloud in a room where both of them had finally stopped pretending. He didn't leave that night. He didn't ask to stay. He simply didn't go. He sat in the chair across from her, and somewhere around midnight she brought 2 cups of chamomile tea and placed one in front of him. No comment from either of them. He accepted it. They sat in a room that was still not hers, impersonal, unlived in, and something between them breathed, honestly, at last, without pretense. He spoke first. Eventually, "I need to say something." His voice was measured but not distant, something new in the register of it. "And I need to get through it without stopping because I'm not practiced at this, and if I lose the thread, I won't find it again." Sorvain looked at him. The faintest movement crossed her face. She nodded. "I made a decision about you." He looked at the cup in his hands. "Not about us. About you. Before I ever genuinely tried to understand you." He paused. "I decided what you were, and I built everything on that decision, and I called it judgment." He looked up at her. "I was wrong. Not the kind of wrong I can recalculate and correct. Wrong in a manner that reaches somewhere calculation cannot." Sorvain was very still. "I don't know how to undo it." His voice dropped. "But I need you to know that I understand what I threw away." He stopped. Started again. "Even if." He held her gaze, even if it's too late for that to mean anything. The room was silent. She set her cup down. She looked at her hands. Then she raised her eyes to his, eyes that had seen all of it, and forgiven none of it yet, but were still, somehow, open. "It's not too late," she said. But Raziel, her voice was clear, each word deliberate. "I am not returning to invisible. I will not go back to being the person in the room you look through." She rested her hand against her abdomen, briefly, the same instinctive gesture from the dinner made visible again. This child is going to know who their mother is. What their mother is. A pause. "I need you to know it too. Not because I told you. Because you finally looked." He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He stood. He crossed the room. And then he did what would have been unthinkable to anyone who knew him. Not in front of allies, not in private, not in any room he had ever occupied. He crouched down in front of her chair. This man who bent his knee to no one, no cause, no empire. He took her hand in both of his, with care, the hold of someone aware, for the first time, of exactly what carelessness costs. "Show me," he said. "Everything. Your father. What you built. What the consortium is." He held her gaze, and his eyes, for the first time she had ever seen, were completely unguarded. "All of it. And I will spend however long it takes actually paying attention." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, full of 3 years, and grief carried alone, and strength never asked for, and a child who had no name yet. Sorvain looked at him for a long moment. At this man she had chosen, once, for reasons she still believed in even when she had stopped believing in him. At this man who had just, for the first time, chosen her back. Not for what she carried, not for what she represented, but for who she was when no one was watching. She turned her hand over in his. She held on. That was the moment. Not a declaration, not a grand reversal. Just two people in a quiet room choosing with full knowledge of what the alternative had already cost them to begin. He had arrived to explain himself and been taken irreversibly apart instead. And she, who had smiled at those divorce papers 11 days ago, already decided to rebuild with or without him, made a different choice tonight. Not to forgive because it came easily, but to choose because it was true. Full circle. A woman invisible for too long, finally seen. Not in spite of everything she was, because of it. If this story reached you, if something in Sorvain's stillness, in the weight she carried alone, in the moment he finally looked at her and understood what he had almost lost, if any part of it landed somewhere real, then you already know why these stories matter. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the next story is already waiting, and it goes deeper than this one. A different woman, a different world, the same truth underneath it all. That the people who are underestimated the longest are almost always the ones the world should have been paying the closest attention to from the very beginning. Don't miss it. And if you stayed until the end, you already know you are exactly who this channel is for.